Welcome to episode 243, Queer Couples Therapy, Tools for Affirming Clinical Work, featuring Laurel Roberts-Meese, licensed marriage and family therapist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am delighted to be joined today by Laurel Roberts-Meese. She has come on today to talk with us about working with queer couples, and this has been one of her specializations in her practice, and I'm just delighted to have her here today. Thank you so much for joining us, Laurel.
Thanks for having me.
So, Laurel, you are a licensed marriage and family therapist out of Southern California. Can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background, and then also this topic and how this came to be one of your specializations?
Yeah. Well, I'm an MFT and I am in Southern California, but my small group practice serves the whole state as well as a couple other states. And I'm really passionate about mentoring the next generation of therapists and also sharing knowledge about some of the specializations. I think there are a lot of really fabulous therapists out there that maybe just don't have the content knowledge to really serve a more diverse client focus. So my specialty is the clients that just light me up, that I can't believe I get paid to work with. They tend to be really driven professionals, people that are cursed with ambition, we joke. Lawyers, entrepreneurs, C-suite execs, and a significant portion of those in my practice are LGBT. And I just really admire the resilience, the diversity, and the commitment to authenticity that the LGBT community has. And I really want them to be better served by the mental health community. So that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Before we really even dive into this topic, can we spend a moment unpacking, what is an LGBT couple? And can we talk about the language here? Already you and I have used a couple of different terms, queer, LGBT. There are a lot of different terms that are going to come up during this conversation. So why don't we start there?
Yeah, absolutely. Language is so important in any marginalized group, right? And language evolves. So, the things that we're saying here today, in 20 years, someone could listen to this and be like, ooh, well, why were they using those words, right? But where we are today is that there's a lot of language to pick from when we talk about the LGBT or queer community. I would hope that most people listening understand the basic acronym LGBT, which stands for lesbian, bisexual, gay, and transgender. And then you use the word queer. I happen to love the word queer. I feel like it's easier to say than LGBT, and it's also more inclusive because there are people in the queer community that don't use one of those particular words, lesbian, bisexual, gay, or transgender, that we still want to be inclusive of, right? And when you start adding letters to that acronym, it gets very long and it's a mouthful. So there are some people that love that word queer, and there are some people, generally older, that are like, no, that's a slur. I would never use that word. So if you're working with queer clients, you want to mirror the language that they are using. So you asked, who are we talking about when we talk about the LGBT community? It's anyone that holds a marginalized identity, either in their sexual orientation or in their gender identity. And a very quick way to differentiate between those two, the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. Sexual orientation is who you go to bed with or who you build a life with, and gender identity is who you go to bed as. Right? It's you all alone in a room, regardless of other people, your internal sense of being masculine or feminine or none of the above or both, right? So it's really anyone who is not a straight cisgender person. And some people would add allosexual, right? That just kind of a typical sexual appetite and attraction to others. Some people really feel like people that have other experiences also belong in the LGBT community.
Thank you. And I think you're right that this is evolving, and how will our ears hear anything down the line? Um, as it stands right now, the most inclusive acronym that I have heard is LGBTQQIP2PSAA, which is a big umbrella that includes questioning queer, intersex,
Mhm.
pansexual, two-spirited, asexual, aromantic, and wanting to acknowledge that for the sake of a verbal conversation today, uh, the default term will be using LGBT or queer, with acknowledgement that we are including all of the different identities that are part of that. And I bring that up because I think when it comes to language, particularly for clinicians who are not part of these communities, um, we can rely on the most visible parts of the community and say, oh, like working with queer couples means a couple of gay men, or it means a couple of lesbians, quote unquote. And there's so much more going on here than that. And I think it's important for us to start at that acknowledgement that there's more here. So, with that, can you speak a little bit about the more here than just these token relationships that we think of that are also monogamous? All of those kind of details that are important to consider.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, Beth, the most of the research on LGBT couples is on same-sex couples. And there's actually not even that much research on same-sex couples. So I think that that is reflective of the reductive ideas people have about LGBT couples. Um, Also interesting to note, a lot of the research has dried up since Obergefell v. Hodge passed and we got marriage equality, that there was less clinical consideration in the research sector for couples that weren't just these straight cisgender pairings, right? Um, so the Gottmans were actually on the forefront of researching same-sex couples, and we got a longitudinal study on same-sex couples. But again, it's just same-sex couples, and that is not at all the sum total of LGBT couples. There are people that are very much part of the queer community that are in relationships that appear to be straight marriages or relationships, or people that trans people that are passing and are not necessarily known to be trans, but that is a significant factor in their relationships or in how they are dating or in their marriage and how they are going about building a family. And so it's not always an observable thing, but some of the content that we're going to talk about, the content knowledge areas that is really important for therapists to have, are going to affect these lesser visible LGBT couples.
In the Gottman's research, certainly starting out primarily with hetero married um, dyadic couples, and now expanding into different spaces, the research is more limited. And I think maybe, I wonder, is that one of the things that intimidates folks who aren't part of the community in considering working with this particular group of people? You had mentioned kind of stepping out of the, what I'll call like token representative couples that you might see in therapy. That starts very early on, like in a therapeutic relationship. If we're on the phone with somebody and they call us and we assume based on the tone of their voice or based on the name in their email what their gender is. And then the language we use when they say, oh, I'd like couples therapy. And you go, oh, are you married? And they say, oh, yes, I'm married. And you say, oh, what's your husband's name?
Mm-hmm. Oops.
Right. And like, there it was.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to establishing safety? And I guess a broad stroke in a conversation about allyship and inclusivity of language from the onset of therapy to bring in queer couples, knowing that our signaling is either saying you're safe here or you're not?
I mean, it is just small changes in language. You can use the word spouse or partner instead of husband or, girlfriend or whatever. You can, part of our intake process is asking someone's pronouns. It takes 10 seconds and people know what you're asking. They're not confused. They get asked this all the time. I'm so glad that it's become part of the culture that we just ask because it takes no effort and it makes people feel safe, right? People that, as long as you're asking in a respectful way, people that they are scanning to see if you're a safe person. Always. Yeah.
One thing I want to throw out there too for our listeners, I had a great conversation with social worker Kyle Bullock about intake processes and documentation and ways to make our process in therapy more affirming. So I encourage you to take a listen into that episode. Kyle brings up some very good points. Getting back to a conversation about queer couples, can you share with us some of the similarities and differences between working with queer versus hetero couples?
Well, the great news is if you're a couples therapist, whatever modality you're currently using is going to work for queer couples. If you are, diehard Gottman or EFT or Imago, you don't have to change anything, right? We're not here to talk about modality. We're here to talk about content knowledge, which is way easier than learning a new modality. And people are really passionate about their modalities. And, the three that I just mentioned, they are evidence-based, or I think Imago's in the process of being kind of declared evidence-based. But it's the content knowledge, which doesn't take that long to learn, right? We're going to go over a lot of it today. So I hope just in terms of quelling any anxiety or uncertainty, that's really helpful. Like you get to keep working in the way that is the best modality for you and applying it in ways that feel really authentic and effective in your practice. And the content knowledge is what's going to help people feel safe because you're not going to be asking a LGBT couple that comes to see you some very basic information about experience. Now, of course, we ask everyone about their individual shared experience, but we can give you kind of a starting place so they're not starting from, absolutely nothing in terms of bringing you into their world.
Thank you. Given that there is not a large breadth of research when working with queer couples, what are we seeing? I think sometimes when we're working with folks who are different than ourselves, particularly, in some checkbox factor, if you will, we might become kind of hyper focused on like, I'm white and that person's not, or I'm straight and that person is queer. And then it's like, that's really not even part of
Yeah.
the
They're
equation
there to
or the
talk about their
right.
relationship with their mother-in-law.
Right.
Nothing to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so can you talk a little bit about kind of the realities for queer couples coming into therapy and how they're similar and different from the realities for hetero couples?
Yeah. I mean, you're going to see a lot of the same topics, plus some additional ones we'll get to. But, couples, they struggle with communication. They struggle with certain specific topics, fighting about money, fighting about where are we going to spend the holidays, the kind of typical hot button topics are going to show up. Or if you're a Gottman person, you're going to see those same four horsemen show up and the antidotes are the same, right? And some of the research is actually really encouraging. The 12-year study that I mentioned really showed that that queer couples are kind of doing a better job in some categories, building egalitarian partnerships, and using more humor in conflict, being less closed off in conflict, and that's really encouraging. And I think a lot of straight couples could learn from that. Like, what if we didn't just default to specific gender roles? What if we stayed emotionally connected even in conflict? Now, this is not to say all queer couples are great at staying connected during conflict, but it's really encouraging.
That's really interesting. Can you share a little bit more about that Gottman study and just kind of the things that stood out to you as being important for us to think about?
Yeah. Um, there tended to be less arguments related to power and control and kind of more fair play when couples were in conflict. This is especially true in lesbian couples, and I'm actually not sure if it was lesbian couples specifically or couples of two women, because they're not the same always. Kind of a square and rectangle analogy there, right? That they were using more, same-sex couples were using more humor and affection, and straight couples were found to be more affected by criticism in conflict than LGBT couples. And gay men tended to show lower physiological arousal during conflict, which meant that they were able to self-soothe better than their straight counterparts. And when it came to kind of really heightened conflict, gay men tended to withdraw and exude less affection, whereas lesbian couples actually did not really withdraw as much, and they were still affectionate, and using that humor, which I thought was just so interesting, right? And it kind of goes against some of the harmful stereotypes and misinformation out there about domestic violence rates among same-sex couples, which I'm actually not totally certain where those sit, but people have this negative idea about how same-sex couples engage in conflict, and it looks like they're actually doing a little better than straight people.
Thank you. Those are some really interesting facts to consider. From an identity development perspective, straight cis folks don't come out.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The day may come.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different experience to be in the world as a queer person, whether you're out or not. And you have different experiences then that you're going to bring into your intimate relationships if you choose to have them. Do you find that pops up for you is like conversations about, I guess, outness?
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's actually the first content area that we were going to talk about in terms of how do couples therapists prime themselves with great content knowledge. Outness is absolutely a big topic, and we could probably do a whole episode on levels of outness and the coming out process. And I got very excited when you said identity development, because, if you're working particularly with Gen Z or younger people, or even people in later stages of life that are just coming into their identity, that can be just such rich fodder for deep therapy work, right? I think I get just slightly pinched around this topic because coming out tends to be the only narrative that queer people get in mass media. It's either coming out or like something else that doesn't go well, and it's often a tragedy, and it's really frustrating to have that be the only narrative out there, right? And it is still a reality that outness, identity development, and potentially being in different stages of outness can affect a queer couple, right? So if one person is not out at work, then that means that the partner doesn't get brought to the company holiday party. If one partner's not out to their family, that level of concealment can be really quite difficult in the relationship, right? And even if people are both out, if they have just different levels of experience in relationship or different comfort levels with physical intimacy or visibility out in public, that might create a good deal of conflict and tension that isn't actually about how compatible they are and how much they love each other. It's kind of an external variable that can really impact them. So that's one of these 6 content areas that's important to be aware of. I'll also say that coming out is not a one-time thing. It's a perpetual thing. You come out over and over and over. In any given situation, a queer person is making an evaluation of if it is safe to come out in that environment. And we certainly want listeners to be passing whatever little tests come up very subtly and, being deemed safe by people that are considering whether or not they should come out to a therapist that they're working with.
Thank you. And thank you for bringing up that point. There's a great conversation from the past with John Sovek specifically about the coming out process and kind of the complexity and exactly what Laurel just said. Like this is not a one-shot deal. And even as you said, even telling a therapist or the assumptions that that therapist is making in that first contact with you or in the subsequent ones says a lot about that safety, because there are these little indicators about, have you considered this other possibility for me or for my life or my relationships? Okay, we talked about the first one. Let's dive in. Let's hit those 6.
Yeah. Well, the second one, I guess we already kind of covered because it is that communication, and it is, looking at how can we actually harness the strengths of queer couples, and do more of them in conflict. So it's communication and communication roadblocks, those 4 horsemen that are showing up. We already talked about communication and how, some couples are doing it a lot better. And for those that need support, it's looking at those 4 horsemen or whatever framework you're using and noticing what the strengths and areas for growth are in the couple.
Thank you. And then moving into that third one.
Yeah. So the third one is family planning. Now, not all couples are planning to expand their family. I think it's really important to acknowledge couples as a family without, that doesn't need to have children or pets or anyone else involved to be a family. You're a family. But if a couple is planning to have children, and they do not have the means to procreate without the assistance of science themselves, that there's an added layer of complexity. Now, I think that there are a lot of therapists that do fertility work or, perinatal work that maybe haven't thought about how easy it is to apply doing fertility therapy work with straight couples to queer couples, right? Because there are a lot of choices to make, and there's a lot of bureaucracy to handle. There's, do we need to switch insurance so that we can get these procedures covered, or are we going to go through adoption? And what does the legal process look like? Are we looking at surrogacy? Are we going to use? There's actually a lot of emotional material around donor involvement and DNA testing. Previous generations of couples that used a donor to conceive and expand their family didn't have to worry about DNA. And now there's actually a lot of discourse around do we want to do any DNA testing? And if it is revealed that our child has other genetic siblings or half siblings, do we want them to know each other? Do we want this to be kind of a community thing? Or do we really want to be just us and not engage with other people that may have some genetic relationship here? And you could do years of therapy just on that for a couple, right? And those decisions and what feels really good to the people bringing a child into the world.
You've said one of the considerations for you in thinking about clinicians working with queer couples, particularly straight clinicians working with queer couples, is about content knowledge. What you just mentioned is absolutely potentially part of what I'll call a straight story. Like it can be part of a straight story. And for clinicians who, regardless of the sexuality or gender of the people they're working with, have no idea about any of the things that you just mentioned, like, where do we get that? Because I mean, you just really quickly rattled off like 20 different considerations. And for me,
Yeah.
speaking as someone who does not work with couples, I'm like, oh
Yeah.
my God, there's so much in it.
Well, I'll throw one more in there, and that is potential discrimination when navigating the school system and or additional medical or therapies for a child with additional needs. I mean, it's so broad, and this is not my area of expertise. Looking at science or legally enhanced family planning. Certainly, there are therapists and trainers that this is what they do day in, day out is, adoption specific therapy or IVF therapy or, uh, donor involvement, genetic findings. Um, uh, so tap into your local, regional, or national network around that topic. Because, you could spend years there learning new things. Yeah.
Well, I think that's also one of the really interesting parts of our work. Like I remember seeing an image not too long ago, and I can't appropriately credit it, but this idea, it's like as a therapist, it's like you never know what you're walking into. That yeah, we're having conversations about how to communicate more assertively with your neighbors, and then it's like, and then what happened? And it's like you just completely change gears. And I think that's one of the other complexities. Like, if we are fortunate enough to have a really solid relationship, let's say with a couple that we're working with, and then this becomes part of the equation, I don't know how many people are going to be open to us saying, huh, I'm really not specialized in these conversations about family planning. But here are some referrals for somebody else. And that consideration of like, how do we get that knowledge sometimes when we may even be learning alongside our clients. And a client might be like, I don't want that. I don't want to go through it with that person who I don't know. I want to go through it with you. And then you're like, oh, okay. Like, let me
Let
learn
me
about
get some
it.
consultation
Yeah.
real quick. Let me see if Beth has a podcast about this.
I don't. Thank you for just identifying that blind spot. Yes. Yeah, I think we do need more training on these topics because I think so often, like as therapists, we just like stumble in and we're like, whoa, okay, have no idea about that one. Like, let me do some research.
Well, and it's so interesting how certain topics just like start showing up on your caseload, and it kind of feels like this, like, well, guess the universe is telling me I got to learn about OCD, you know?
Yeah, I have absolutely had that experience too. So anyway, off of that third point, but I am glad that you labeled those considerations because they are more likely to come up in our work with these couples than otherwise.
Well, I'll say one more thing about this, which is, you mentioned anytime something outside of our uh, scope of knowledge shows up with a therapist, I think that with a client, I think we have a ethical obligation to just say like, hey, I see this is a really big part of your experience, and that this is, perhaps the primary thing that we need to work on. I'm not a specialist in this. I don't have a lot of training in it. And I really enjoy working with you and I want to support you. And if you need to go work with a specialist, I can absolutely get some names for you. Sometimes it actually might make sense for there to be like an adjunct treatment on a specific thing. like let's say someone needs ERP, but we're doing greater relational work, but to give them the choice, because if you have built that relationship and that trust with them, that's no small thing. And we know the relationship is foundational to the outcome of therapy. So you don't want to just be passing them off because the content knowledge is new to you. Now, sometimes it's absolutely not appropriate to continue if someone needs a higher level of care, or it feels like it could be harmful, or just, plain unproductive. But making clients feel empowered with the information to make choices about their own care is basic respect and decency for them as clients.
Thank you for bringing that up. And actually, I want to go a little deeper on that, because I think you brought up a really important consideration with this community and really with any marginalized community. I think for folks who are not part of the community, it can feel like extra intimidating. It's like, oh, I could get the content knowledge. And I don't have that lived experience. I don't know what it's like to grow up with these considerations, whatever they are, whatever kind of marginalization. And I think that may be a real deterrent for clinicians in working with queer folks and working with queer couples specifically. And I'm glad you brought up that point about that relationship. And even just speaking for myself, speaking as a queer clinician that was not for a number of years specifically working with and seeking queer clients, that transition to like, oh, like even I am like, I hesitate. What do I need to know? And like, can I do this? And I remember having that conversation with a colleague of like, well, wait, what is foundational to the work that we're doing? And what is foundational is respect and relationship and connection and patience and empathy. And hopefully we are embodying those anyway. And like you said, it's just a matter of the content. But so for the clinicians who are listening, I'm guessing Laura and I will have the same perspective on this. Like whether you're part of the community or not, you can support the community.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, I have an associate in my practice who is straight, and she does incredible work with LGBT couples because she's taken the time to educate herself. She has a lot of experience with this, and she understands what it means to be a therapist that is not part of the community, but is serving and uplifting this community. And her couples love her, you know? So you definitely don't have to be part of the community to really elevate your LGBT clients.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Off of number 3, on to number 4. What's next, Laurel?
Yeah. Ooh, gender roles.
That sounds like fun.
Fun or not fun, depending on who you ask, right? The true definition of queerness is basically anything that is transgressive, right? That is going against a default. And I think, queer couples are doing a great job of self-designing what the gender roles in their relationship look like. Now, particularly for same-sex couples, there isn't going to be a default masculine and feminine. So you kind of just get to decide who does what. And I feel like straight couples should be doing this too, because I have a feeling that there are women out there who have no idea that they're actually great car mechanics because they've just never tried, because it's not part of the gender role. And what they were told should be their interests in terms of supporting the family, right? And, men that are fabulous nurturers and caretakers and can really, be the primary person to take care of a sick kid, or I feel like we're losing so much potential when we don't consider that we can thrive doing many, many things that are not within a specific box. So queer couples are doing a better job of defining the gender roles, and even just down to like who does the domestic labor in their relationship. my partner and I had a negotiation at one point, and it was decided I will take care of all the spiders. If there is a spider in the house, it is my job. And this is a very silly example, but why aren't we having greater conversations with straight couples about, like, well, why is it that this person is doing this task and the other is doing that, right? So, that being said, sometimes couples don't attend to this, like, hey, we kind of do have to decide what roles we're going to play. And this is not to say that there has to be a masculine and feminine. Absolutely not. That's kind of the point for some queer couples, is that there isn't. But to be really intentional about how you self-design. And I definitely have worked with some people who felt resentful that something just defaulted to them because they weren't interested, like domestic labor wise, that they were just like, I don't want to take care of this, or like, I don't want to be the one that always initiates hard conversations or plans or sex, right? That you might need to actually talk about where each person's comfort zone is. And if neither person is particularly comfortable with it, to talk about, okay, how are we going to handle this, right? In this same category is it's pretty nuanced, but there are definitely many people in the LGBT community who are either over sexualized or under sexualized, and that can come out in whatever gender roles, or I wish there was a better term than gender roles, but the kind of architectural design of the relationship. I know that, some masculine presenting women are frustrated. Like, I cannot go out in public with a more feminine woman without everyone assuming that she's my partner. And it's just my friend, right? That there's this kind of like over sexualization there. And that doesn't serve anyone, to over or under sexualize anyone. And that can happen within the relationship, not just externally.
I'm glad that we're having this kind of conversation here, because one of the things I was thinking too, as we've been talking, are like the additional cultural nuances that are layered on top of this. So what people are historically over sexualized and under sexualized, layered on top of being part of the queer community, and the way that this is kind of manifesting. And it sounds like where you're coming from is more the idea that clinicians need to have awareness about these norms that have been perpetuated in society, and then how they may be influencing the people who are sitting in front of us.
Yeah. Yeah. That actually, we'll talk about internalized homophobia and homophobic violence in a bit, but this is one way that these kind of like insidious ideas about the community get into the relationship itself. They kind of seep in, and it may not actually feel that authentic to the people in the relationship. And a therapist can be like, well, do you want to be doing this particular task or filling this role? And it can be so liberating for a person to be like, no, I'm not interested in that at all.
I love the language you used when you said relationship architect. I think that reference of relationship architect is so powerful because it gives flexibility to the couple to design, as you said, regardless of queerness.
Mm-hmm. There's a really interesting, but it's a little bit limited book called Fair Play by Eve Rodsky that talks about, it's very much for straight couples, and it's about just the huge inequities in domestic and emotional labor, the mental load that straight women are facing. And there's actually a card game that comes with it, which is kind of a systematized way of dividing up domestic labor. And while I think that, the execution of it may be a little rocky, and it's very much about straight couples with kids, which is a very narrow focus. I love this idea of just kind of like putting all the cards on the table and like you choosing what roles you're going to fill. So like I am always going to be the social secretary in my relationship. Like even if my partner were to take that card figuratively, like it's always going to be me, and that's fine, right? But if we think of it as like, hey, we want this to be equitable, but what feels equitable to us, sometimes having that actual visual can be very helpful. And sometimes it is not helpful at all. Sometimes it's more damaging.
Thank you. I do appreciate you bringing up that point and that resource, and that's a conversation we've had in other uh, episodes about couples in like these roles, and like basically, are they working for you? Are they working for us? And empowering people to be able to ask those questions. Okay, moving from point number 4 into point number 5.
Family of origin. Now, this also shows up with straight couples, right? But there's this added layer of how accepting are the families involved here? Are there cultural or religious considerations? Like, are we gonna tell Mima that we're a couple? She's 98, and it would just be upsetting to her. And maybe just for the next few Hanukkahs, we're not gonna, right? And that's a conversation that needs to be had proactively, right? But with this kind of greater family of origin thing, looking at how, if there is any lack of acceptance, this is going to affect all the milestones. Things that are meant to be celebratory, weddings, birthdays, promotions, holidays, are going to be tinged with this sadness or this grief about not having that connection to family or not being as accepted as you deserve to be by family. And it's also going to make hard things like death, like illness, even harder to have a lack of family support. And so there's just kind of this like kind of queerness can add like a steroid quality to existing family dynamics.
There's also the consideration about quote unquote chosen family.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak about that in your work with queer couples as well?
Yeah. It is vitally important for anyone with a marginalized identity to have community. So we know that people who see themselves in the couples and faces around them are going to have better health outcomes, right? And historically, because there has been so much homophobic violence and rejection from the mainstream culture, queer community has been quite excellent at forming its own culture and its own subculture and really taking care of each other. And there's some really just beautiful examples from history in the height of the AIDS crisis. Even though lesbians were largely unaffected by the AIDS crisis, they took care of gay men. They were staffing the hospitals and the crisis centers because they recognized, like, hey, this is our community. Even if these are not the people that we date or hang out with, it's important that we take care of them as best we can. And that continues. I mean, there's a closeness that is easy to build among other queer people.
And then that is another resource.
It's also an antidote to internalized homophobia and other stressors that come up in either just being in the community or in the relationship itself.
Stepping into point number 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is that homophobic violence and internalized homophobia. I said previously, homophobic violence and even microaggressions, they did not magically go away when marriage equality became the law of the land in the US, right? There's still very much homophobic violence and microaggressions. And couples therapy can be a place where that comes up, either in addressing how that homophobia has seeped into the self-concept of one or both people in the couple, or just trauma processing. If people had a really traumatic experience of any kind of ostracization or violence, that would certainly come up in couples therapy. Internalized homophobia is poison to a queer person. It just completely erodes your self-esteem and your sense of being deserving of love and respect and partnership. And if you don't believe that you deserve love and respect and partnership, your relationships are going to disintegrate pretty fast, or not exist, or just be a complete roller coaster that feels unmanageable.
When working with couples and this possibility of the trauma and the internalized homophobia being in the room, how do you draw the line between, what is couples work and what is individual work in the management of that?
Well, with any shared trauma, you're going to be doing an assessment of how is each person experiencing it. That might include doing a thorough attachment history on each partner, or I also do EMDR, and I have definitely done some EMDR sessions where I did it as a couples therapy, and that the one partner who was very well resourced and able to be present and supportive was there in support of the other's EMDR, and sometimes switching back and forth. Which you have to be very thorough in your assessment of if that's appropriate, right? I think it depends too much on the couple. I can't make like a blanket statement, but if it's very clear in the couple's work that internalized homophobia is deeply impacting one person and the other is feeling pushed away or feeling like there's some sabotage happening, then yeah, you would probably want to refer the person who's really struggling directly internally with it to their own individual therapy. But sometimes just talking about how it's showing up and like, hey, I felt really pushed away the other day when you said that. What was happening for you? And just seeing what comes up. Like I said, it's insidious. It can really show up in surprising ways. And sometimes as the therapist, you have that authority to be the one to say, hey, you know what? You do deserve a loving relationship. This relationship, you love each other so much. And there's this thing getting in the way, right? Sometimes hearing that, particularly if you're a straight person, if you're a straight therapist, being the one to validate and uplift that can be really healing. That you may be sitting in front of a couple where they have literally never heard a straight person say a positive or kind thing about an LGBT couple. So be aware of the power that you have to uplift these people.
As we've been talking about this, we've used the word couple, which, typically we're going to be looking at that through a lens of two people under the queerness umbrella, polyamory. How is it similar and different from dyadic couples counseling?
Great question. And I really appreciate you broadening how we think about this topic. Because, like I said earlier, when you get to be your own relationship architect, maybe you're going to bring in more than one person, right? I think, modality wise, my guess would be that it would be a combination of, Gottman or EFT or Imago and systems theory, right? Because you're creating a system. Now, sometimes a system can be two people, but generally when we talk about systems, we're talking about more than two people. So there are some people that do couples therapy that don't do family therapy. And I understand that, but looking at this as a hopefully loving, thriving system. And some of these content areas are probably going to show up in that system.
Is there any research about poly couples, about folks who are in open relationships, things like that?
I don't know. That's
Like
I would guess that there's not enough. I mean, there's already not enough about queer couples, and I would include many polycules, and systems are part of the queer community. So I would guess that it's pretty limited.
one of the common threads that I'm picking up throughout this conversation, really in my mind, comes down to awareness of our own conditioning and bias. Thinking about the language and the signaling that we're using, the assumptions that we're making based on some phenotypic assessment that we've made. And, even down to the idea of a person having a single partner is absolutely a reflection of that kind of dominant culture and that narrative. Is it then foundational, not just for cis straight clinicians, for all clinicians, to do the work and deconstruct that conditioning that says this is what a couple looks like, or these are the bits of the people who are allowed to get married, or
Right.
whatever it is, like these little details that we have been subjected to from
From birth.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, from infancy, about like kind of the rules, and the way that those change as we evolve in different cultures, as we move, as we change as individuals, because it feels like there's so much potential for any of us, regardless of the community, whether we're part of it or not, to perhaps inadvertently perpetuate.
Well, I've got two responses to that. I don't think it would be possible for us to proactively go out and get all the information about every type of relationship and every client that could ever possibly show up in our office or Zoom. Like, that's just not possible, so please don't try. What matters so much more is the openness and curiosity that you bring to the people who do come into your practice, right? It's a fundamental openness and using very broad, inclusive language. So, one of the intake questions I ask is, tell me about your life. What does your day to day look like? Who is in it? And who would be important for your therapist to know about? And sometimes I hear about a partner. Sometimes I hear about a pet. Sometimes I hear about a work spouse, and that really tells me how they are oriented to their day to day and the people in their life, rather than just saying, are you married? Right? Tell me about your day to day, who's in it and who's important, right? You're asking kind of the same ish question, but in a way that really invites full authenticity and expression on behalf of the client.
So expanding on these ideas kind of breaking some of the stereotypes and the norms that we've held, not just as like clinicians but also just like as humans, what are some of the complexities when interpreting the research, the limited research in application to queer folk and to queer couples?
Well, we have to remember that these studies often come out of institutions that are not without their flaws and biases, and that the samples in these studies may not be totally representative. And I'm going to personally, me, Laurel, confidently say that they are not reflective of the greater queer community. And that as with all research, that the researchers are asking a particular question that may not be the right question, right?
So in that way, maintaining clinical awareness for the blind spots in the research, and with any luck at all, we're doing that anyway. To say just because some study said this doesn't mean anything about you, the human being who's sitting in front of me, and your lived experience of the world. But then also I could see for you as someone who specializes in working with queer couples, being mindful and making space for all of these considerations beyond queerness, in awareness of power dynamics and marginalization and privilege, and that these are just, if they're part of who humans are, then they're part of couples.
Yeah. Yeah. Or systems, right? Because even if someone is not partnered, they are part of systems. Yeah. I wanted to speak to what you do if you mess up. If you use the wrong word or you say something that offends a queer client, which I have done. I think we have, as therapists, we have all really stepped in it, you know. Um, and that is, if you make a mistake, quickly recover. So, for example, I once misgendered a non-binary client of mine, and luckily, I knew not to be like, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Is this okay?" Right? Just say, "I'm so sorry," and then use the correct pronouns, and then move on. Later, I came back to it and said, "Is there anything that you want to say to me about that?" Right? Because LGBT people are often tasked with soothing and appeasing straight people, like, "Oh no, you're fine. I didn't feel microaggressed against." And that is not their job. So please don't put your queer clients in the position of having to reassure you, and just apologize when you make a mistake, correct it quickly, and move on. And there is also a space to come back to it and have a corrective emotional experience as long as the focus stays on the client.
I appreciate that you brought up that point. And I think that is particularly for folks who are not part of the community. I think that is one of the potential intimidating factors. It's like I'm afraid of using the wrong pronouns. I'm afraid of talking like there's only another person in a relationship when there are two, or whatever it is. And what I was thinking when you said, like, we've all stepped in it, it's like, and if we haven't, then we're probably not being honest with ourselves.
Yeah. And if a client corrects you, say thank you. Don't say sorry, say thank you. Thank you for reminding me what pronouns the person who's not in the room uses, right? Thank you.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought it up. So thank you for not letting us finish this conversation without making that point, particularly when the takeaway from the conversation is about creating safe, supportive spaces for queer couples. I'm glad that you brought that in. For clinicians who are listening and want to learn more about these kind of content areas that you've named. You've listed 6 today, but goodness knows we can only cover so much in an hour, and we could never, ever take any group of people and be like, okay, we've said everything there is to be said.
I mean, we didn't even talk about intersectionality. So, people that have multiple identities, maybe they are a lesbian and trans, or maybe they are a trans person of color. Like we didn't touch that at all. So, yes, there's so much more. But this is a place to start.
For folks who see this as the starting point and want to dive in more, what do you think are like the best resources, websites, people?
Well, there are often really good local resources. So, PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, which is I'm hoping they update their language because it's not just lesbians and gays. This is for straight people wanting to become more of an ally. There are local chapters and national resources there. Any resource that you find, I'm just really curious who is offering it, right? So there are plenty of large national resources, but who has a seat at the table in those organizations? Because there are organizations, run almost entirely by gay men that are doing incredible work. It doesn't necessarily serve, let's say, the trans community or lesbians of color, right? So just look at like, okay, who's at the table? Who is this information from? and who's it for? So I don't have, I mean, there's just so many, so many content areas. I don't have one in particular, but there are also a lot of really great therapists who are providing trainings, who really, this is their expertise. So pay them for an hour of consultation. Find someone whose work you really respect, or, they have a niche that is way nichier than this conversation today. And yeah, start just ask questions, ask big open questions. And it goes without saying, we always put the client first, right?
Thank you. And Laurel, for people who have been listening and want to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way to do that?
We've got a website, which is laureltherapy.net, and we're also on Instagram at Laurel Therapy Collective.
Fantastic. I think you've covered many important points today, and my hope is that it does bring more clinicians of all types into the fold to provide more support. The fact of the matter is there are not enough therapists to go around. And it is a beautiful gift when clinicians can expand their offerings and support more people. Thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate it, Laurel. This has been a really interesting and thoughtful conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.